Welcome, traveler. Tonight, let us journey together into the cobbled streets and quiet corridors of the medieval world, but not with knights or kings, no. Tonight, we follow the footsteps of a humble physician, a man who heals with herbs and listens more than he speaks. Let your breath slow. Let your shoulders soften. This story is meant to be heard gently, with your eyes closed and your mind ready to drift. And if you find comfort here, consider supporting this quiet corner of history by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. For now, rest. Let the story begin. Chapter 1. The morning bell, waking in a city of smoke and stone. The morning began not with sunlight, but with the sound of iron striking iron. Somewhere in the misty labyrinth of the medieval town, the monastery bell rang once, low and slow, calling the monks to prayer, and with it, waking the city like a gentle hand shaking the shoulder of a restless sleeper. The bell's voice echoed through the narrow cobbled streets, slipping past shuttered windows and drifting over tiled rooftops blackened with chimney soot. It was not loud, but it was old, and like all old things, it held weight. In a modest stone house near the edge of the market square, a physician stirred in bed. His name was Master Arlen, though few called him that outside of formality. To most, he was simply the doctor, or the quiet one who listens before he speaks. He opened his eyes not with surprise, but with a slow breath, like one returning from a distant shore. His chamber was dim, lit only by the pale blue light pressing through the oiled parchment window panes and the faint golden glow of a dying ember in the hearth. There was no rush in his waking. The world would come to him soon enough. Arlen sat upright and waited a moment before moving further. He always did, not out of laziness or stiffness, but from a kind of reverence, a silent ritual of noticing. He listened to the creak of the wooden beams above him, to the scratching sound of a rat along the far wall, to the faint drip of water from the corner where last night's rain still clung to the stone. Outside, a cartwheel groaned somewhere near the fishmonger's lane. The town was beginning to move, and in that moment, as his feet touched the cold floor and his hands found the wool cloak laid neatly at the foot of the bed, he became once more not a man sleeping, but a doctor waking. His role did not begin with appointments or diagnoses. It began with attention. In a world where illness was often blamed on spirits or imbalance, he believed in something quieter: observation, patience, and the strange honesty of the body. He rose without speaking, pulled the cloak around his shoulders, and crossed to the hearth to stir the embers. The fire responded slowly, reluctantly, like breath returning to a tired chest. The warmth spread gradually through the room, though the air remained cool and smelled faintly of herbs, sage, rosemary, and dried rose hips, hanging from a beam overhead. His home was simple but ordered, every shelf lined with bowls, mortars, folded cloths, and scrolls inked in a hand both practiced and gentle. A small wooden table beside the window held a flask of rainwater, a chipped cup, and a worn leather-bound notebook, its pages filled with records of fevers, wounds, and quiet recoveries. Arlen took a sip of the water and washed his face with cloth soaked the night before, cool against his skin. He did not speak. There was no one to speak to yet, and in silence he found clarity. He lit a candle not for light. Dawn had begun to glow more clearly through the mist, but for companionship. The flame flickered steadily, casting its light upon a nearby drawing of the human body, a humble rendering based on ancient texts and careful watching. He touched the edge of the parchment with 2 fingers, a gesture not unlike prayer, then turned toward the table to begin preparing for the day. The bell rang again, softer now, or perhaps farther away. The city was awake, and so was he. He dressed slowly, as he always did, layering the garments not for vanity or ceremony, but for their purpose and meaning. First came the linen undershirt, stiff and a little scratchy from repeated washing in lye soap, but clean and whole. Then his woolen tunic dyed a deep, faded green, a color chosen not for style but because it did not show stains easily. Over that, the long outer robe, brown and well-mended, with sleeves just wide enough to roll above the elbow when blood or ointment required access to the skin. Around his waist, he tied the simple belt that carried his pouch of tools. A small blade, tweezers, needles, and threads of various thickness. There was also a tiny glass vial of vinegar, another of rose oil, and a scrap of cloth infused with lavender. He inspected the contents out of habit, even though they rarely changed. Each item had its place, its use, and its own memory. The blade, dulled slightly, had once removed a splinter the size of a nail from a baker's hand. The lavender cloth had calmed a child before cauterization. These were not merely tools. They were extensions of his work and of his care. The room smelled faintly of beeswax and damp parchment, the scent that came from long nights writing by candlelight, charting symptoms or sketching wound patterns in silence. He moved to the window and unlatched the shutter. The morning light entered more freely now, muted by the mist, but revealing more of the street below. A fishmonger rinsing the stones with salted water, a boy chasing a chicken through a puddle, a woman adjusting her bonnet with one hand and holding a bundle of sticks in the other. The sounds of the town were still muted, as if the air itself hadn't quite decided to speak loudly yet. He watched without urgency, simply letting the rhythm of the town settle into his bones. There was something holy in those first few minutes of observation, before he spoke to anyone, before he touched a wound, before he was once again called to interpret pain or fear or uncertainty. These glimpses of life, unguarded and mundane, reminded him of why he did what he did. Not for coin, though it helped. Not for glory, there was none in tending boils and fevers, but for presence, for being the one who did not turn away. He turned from the window and moved toward his small wooden cabinet, which housed jars of dried roots, crushed minerals, and bundles of herbs wrapped in cloth and string. He selected a sprig of marjoram to chew. It eased his stomach and helped focus the mind, and placed a second in his sleeve near the wrist, where its scent would linger throughout the day. He paused to add 2 spoonfuls of dried comfrey to a cloth sachet, knowing he'd likely be called to visit an old woman later whose joints ached with the dampness of autumn. Everything he prepared not from hope or panic, but from pattern, from the rhythm of life as he had come to understand it. Illnesses moved through the town like tides. Some days brought fevers, others burns or accidents. Sometimes there was nothing, and then, just as suddenly, there was too much. But he no longer feared it. He simply readied himself and waited. And as he tightened the belt around his tunic and stepped toward the door, he felt that gentle readiness again, not of battle but of purpose. Outside, the market bell was beginning to ring. Another sound, another signal. The world was unfolding, and he would meet it as he always did, one patient at a time. The door creaked softly on its hinges as Arlen stepped out into the morning chill, pulling his cloak tighter around his shoulders as a breeze swept up the alleyway from the river. The sky remained overcast, and the scent of the night's rain still clung to the stones like memory. The street outside his home was already beginning to animate in its usual quiet chaos. Bakers stacking trays of flatbread, a toothless man pushing a cart full of straw, a coughing priest scolding a novice who had tracked mud into the chapel steps. Arlen walked with deliberate pace, his boots making a muted rhythm on the wet stones. He carried no walking stick and wore no hat, though the wind tugged playfully at his collar. He greeted no one yet. He preferred to move like part of the scenery until the first true encounter of the day demanded his voice. It gave him time to listen, to the street, the weather, the mutterings of people who didn't know he was there. Often, he found their truths not in what they said to him, but in what they said when they thought no one heard. The smells of the morning shifted as he moved, the yeasty warmth of bread giving way to sharp vinegar from the tavern's emptied slop bucket, then to the clean sting of soap from a woman scrubbing her steps with a bristled broom. There was no true sanitation in the town, at least not as modern minds would understand it, but there was a rhythm to cleanliness, especially in the lower quarters where people couldn't afford to be sick. Arlen passed a group of children kicking a rag ball, their laughter rising like birdsong, then rounded a corner where the butcher's stall was being opened, already reeking faintly of iron and salt. He noted every sound and smell with practiced ease, like a scribe reading the margins of a worn text. It told him what season they were truly in, how the town's health fared, whether water had gone stale in the barrels or something worse lingered in the air. Most people passed through life with their senses dulled by habit, but Arlen had sharpened his like knives, not because he was gifted, but because he could not afford to miss the signs that others ignored. He reached the edge of the market square, where his day would truly begin. A small bench sat under a crooked awning of woven reeds, and there he paused, not to rest but to watch. The townsfolk were gathering now, slowly, warily, like birds sensing unseen movement. Some came for trade, others for news, and a few, though they would not say it aloud, lingered in hopes of glimpsing him, the doctor. There was a particular way people walked when they were in pain but trying to hide it. He saw it in the baker's daughter as she favored her left foot, in the way a weaver's apprentice held her wrist too carefully, in the slight dampness of an old man's cough 2 stalls away. Arlen observed it all without alarm. Pain was not failure. It was simply a message, and messages required listening before reply. Soon, someone would approach him, perhaps hesitantly, perhaps already in tears. But for now, he let the rhythm of the town rise around him, the bleating of a goat, the creak of carts, the scrape of coin, and with it, the unspoken truth of his profession. That medicine, in its purest form, begins not with what you carry in your pouch, but with how you see the world. Chapter 2. Preparing the tools, herbs, steel, and faith. Before the first patient arrived, before the sick sought him out or messengers summoned him to cramped quarters and shadowed bedsides, Arlen would return briefly to his workspace. A modest room tucked behind his sleeping chamber, not much larger than a monk's cell, but filled with the quiet weight of purpose. Here was where healing began, though not in the way the town often imagined. It was not the blade that mattered most, nor even the tinctures and tonics. It was preparation itself. He stood at the threshold for a moment before entering, as he always did, letting his eyes fall on the familiar arrangement. The long oak table worn smooth at the edges, shelves stacked with earthenware jars, beeswax candles, scrolls of old knowledge copied with care, linen cloths folded into squares, and his instruments, each one polished and laid out as if for ritual. The morning light filtered through a narrow window, touching the glass vials so that they glowed faintly. Red for wine tincture, gold for infused oil, green for ground mint and sage. It was a silent symphony of color, texture, and scent. Nothing moved but the dust in the beam of sunlight, dancing like tiny spirits between thought and action. He began, as always, with his hands. Cleanliness in his time was not what it would one day become. There was no concept yet of invisible life, no understanding of the microscopic, but Arlen had learned, through careful experience, that ritualistic washing mattered, not only for what it removed, but for what it focused. He poured water, cooled overnight in a clay jug, into a copper bowl and added a few drops of rosemary and vinegar. The scent rose with the steam as he warmed it briefly over the coals. Then, slowly, he washed palms, fingers, wrists, and under the nails, each motion deliberate, quieting the mind as much as cleansing the skin. As he dried his hands on a strip of linen, he looked over the blades. There were 5. One curved, one straight, one hooked, and 2 finer ones used for cutting abscesses and draining swellings. He did not fear their sharpness, though they carried pain. He feared only using them without cause. Every cut must be earned. Every intrusion must be necessary. And so he lifted each one and inspected it in the morning light, looking for even the smallest rust or crack. Metal could betray. Flesh already suffered enough. Once the blades were deemed ready, he turned to his mortars and pestles. Today he would need a salve. He could feel it in the weather, in the way the mist clung to the joints. Likely someone would arrive with swollen fingers or knees, and for that he would grind willow bark with beeswax, a touch of lard, and a crushed mint leaf for cooling. He reached for the willow first, pulling it from a jar labeled in faded ink. Salix. The bark flaked easily into the bowl, fragrant and earthy. As he ground it with rhythmic pressure, the scent grew richer, thicker, filling the space around him like incense. He worked slowly, unhurried, pausing now and then to add the other ingredients, each chosen not just for their physical properties, but for their spirit. Mint for clarity, wax for holding, fat for softness, and bark for memory. The tools obeyed his hands because his hands obeyed attention. In the quiet of this task, Arlen found something deeper than medicine. He found stillness, not the stillness of inaction, but the stillness of focus. The world would knock soon, sometimes with bleeding hands, sometimes with desperate eyes. And when it did, he would be ready, not only with bomb and blade, but with calm. The cabinet against the far wall held the more curious items of his trade, things not easily categorized, things the town gossiped about in whispers but that Arlen treated with the same calm neutrality as a piece of linen or a dried leaf. There was a small leather pouch of powdered antler, taken from a stag said to have lived 20 winters, a bundle of raven feathers, charred slightly at the tips, and a tiny scroll rolled and tied with red string, containing a blessing from an old nun who no longer remembered her own name but whose prayers were still offered and believed to hold power. None of these items had proven medicinal value in his mind, but Arlen knew that healing often came as much from belief as from balm, and so he kept them, not as talismans but as tools of reassurance, for others, yes, but also for himself on the days when logic failed and pain lingered for no reason. His fingers moved over them not with superstition, but with respect. The world, after all, was full of things no book could explain, and arrogance had no place in the work of healing. He took down a wooden box, carefully latched and sealed with a strip of cloth. Inside were his dried petals, rose, chamomile, calendula, and lavender, harvested in early summer when their oils were richest and their beauty untouched by the heat. He unfolded a sheet of parchment and laid it flat on the table, then scattered a pinch of each flower onto its surface, arranging them like a miniature meadow. A simple mixture he would later steep into a tea for restlessness or grief. People often came to him with ailments of the body, but they left lighter when the heart was gently touched. He had long suspected that much of what he treated was loneliness in disguise, a wife who coughed not from illness, but from silence, a blacksmith with back pain born of never being asked how he truly slept at night. And so, among his tools were not only blades and tonics, but soft herbs and warm drinks, and the practice of listening without interruption. When the petals were arranged to his liking, he folded the parchment slowly, as if closing a letter never to be sent, and placed it beside his satchel. Next came the scrolls. Arlen unrolled one carefully, smoothing it along the grain of the table. The writing was cramped but elegant, a copy he had made himself of an older treatise, part Galen, part local lore. The margins were full of his own notes, scribbled in charcoal, some marked with a small X to return to later. He read not because he had forgotten, but because he believed memory must be refreshed like a wound cleaned before stitching. He reviewed the passage on abscess drainage and infection, common this time of year, when the air turned damp and the streets grew slick with runoff from the butchers and fish stalls. The drawing beside the text was crude, a circle with lines, but it sparked recognition, not understanding. He turned the scroll over and looked briefly at another, a short list of observed symptoms from last autumn's fever, including dates, weather, and which herbs had helped. It was not great scholarship, but it was honest. That, he felt, was more valuable. He rolled the scrolls and tied them again, placing them into a leather satchel that now smelled of ink and elder bark. When he closed the cabinet door, he paused again, not to admire his work, but to breathe in the silence before the day began. As the final step in his morning preparations, Arlen opened the narrow wooden drawer beneath his work table. Inside, wrapped in a strip of gray cloth, lay his crucifix, a tiny silver relic gifted by a passing pilgrim many years ago in exchange for a salve that soothed a burning rash. Though Arlen was not one for public piety, he seldom crossed himself in the street or quoted scripture aloud. He held a deep and personal reverence for symbols, not for what they proved, but for what they reminded him, that the work of healing was never his alone. He placed the crucifix gently atop his satchel, not out of obligation, but out of rhythm. Each object now assembled, each vial closed and each note secured. He stood still for a moment beside the table, letting his breath settle. It was not a prayer he whispered, but it was close, a slow release of thought, a quiet acknowledgement of all that might lie ahead. In the coming hours, he might be asked to lance a boil, or to hold the hand of a man who would not survive the week. He might be given no answers, but he would still be required to listen, to act, and most of all, to remain. He wrapped the satchel with its leather strap and set it beside the door. Then he returned once more to the shelf of herbs, this time for a personal remedy. A small jar of lemon balm soaked in honey. With a fingertip, he touched the thick golden mixture to his tongue. It was not for illness but for clarity. It sharpened his senses, calmed his nerves, and reminded him that the body, even his own, must be tended with care. He tucked the jar away, not in his satchel, but into a pocket sewn into the lining of his outer robe. A pocket only he knew was there. Not every remedy was for others. Some were for the doctor himself, to keep him from becoming dull in spirit or too heavy in heart. With his tools now packed, his mind settled, and the morning still young, Arlen opened the door of his workspace and stepped into the hallway. The light had shifted slightly, the fog outside growing thinner, the blue of the sky hinting through above the rooftops. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster crowed again, late to its task. The sound made him smile, faintly, not from humor, but from recognition. Even the smallest signals had their place. He passed through the house with slow, confident steps, touching the wooden beam above the threshold as he exited. A habit picked up from an old tutor, meant to remind the doctor that every exit is also an entrance. Outside, the air had warmed slightly, the mist now turning to dew. The voices in the street had grown louder, vendors calling out their goods, children calling to one another in play, someone shouting about spoiled milk. The world was awake. Arlen looked to the east, where the sun now peaked above the tiled roofs and chimneys, catching the smoke and turning it gold. The city, as always, was imperfect, soot-streaked, uneven, filled with both suffering and song. But it was his place of work, his place of witness, and today, like every day before, he would walk into it prepared, not only with herbs and steel, but with faith. Not the faith of dogma or doctrine, but the quiet kind. The faith that listening mattered, that pain could be softened, and that even in a world so rough-edged and uncertain, a man with open eyes and steady hands could still do good. Chapter 3. The first patient, pain in silence. The knock was soft, barely more than the touch of fingers against wood. but Arlen heard it clearly. He always did. His ears, trained over years to detect the difference between a child's hesitant tap and the urgent pounding of fear, could interpret such things faster than speech. This knock was neither rushed nor confident. Came at an in-between rhythm, slow, respectful, and uncertain. He stepped to the door and opened it without haste. On the threshold stood a man in his late 40s, wrapped in a patched wool cloak too thin for the lingering damp of morning. His face was familiar, though Arlen had not seen him in months. A leatherworker from the edge of the southern wall. The man's eyes were sunken, his skin pale, and there was a tension in his mouth that spoke of quiet endurance, not of sudden illness. Arlen stepped aside without speaking and motioned the man in. Words, he knew, were not always needed at first. The man entered with the cautious reverence of someone stepping into a church, though he said nothing of God, only removing his cloak and holding it in folded arms like an offering. The room was already warm from the morning fire, and the light through the shutters made gentle patterns on the stone floor. Arlen gestured to the low stool beside the hearth while he took his seat across from it, near the table where his tools and scrolls waited. For a long moment, neither man spoke. It was not uncomfortable, only careful. Eventually, the leatherworker exhaled through his nose and placed a hand gently over his lower abdomen. "A heaviness," he said simply, his voice rasping as if the words had taken effort to cross his throat. Arlen nodded once and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "When did it begin?" he asked, not sharply, but as though picking up the thread of a story already begun. The man answered slowly, haltingly, as though remembering while speaking. 2 weeks passed. A tightness at first, then the ache. Now it comes in waves. I thought it would pass. He did not apologize. Men rarely did when they waited too long to seek help. Arlen did not judge. He had seen stronger men felled by pride than by fever that he reached for his satchel and opened it with quiet hands, removing the folded linen cloth that held his more delicate instruments. Not blades, those would not be needed yet, but thin rods of wood for pressure, a rounded horn cup for cupping the skin, and a small glass vial of oil steeped with mustard seed. Arlen did not move directly to the body. First, he observed the way the man sat, slightly hunched, guarding the left side. The faint sheen of sweat across his brow, not from heat but from strain. The tension in his jaw when he swallowed. Pain often spoke louder through posture than through words. "Lie back," Arlen said gently, gesturing to the padded bench behind the hearth. The leatherworker obeyed, lifting himself carefully and settling down with a wince he tried to hide. Arlen placed a rolled cloth beneath the man's knees to ease the tension in his lower spine, then began pressing along the abdomen with steady, practiced fingers. He did not ask if it hurt. He watched the man's eyes instead. They widened slightly at the lower left quadrant. Arlen made a note of it in silence and continued. Pain, after all, often preferred not to be named, only understood. The skin beneath Arlen's hands was warm, but not fevered. That was a small mercy. He pressed again, slower now, feeling beneath layers of flesh and muscle for tension, for imbalance, for that subtle resistance the body gave when something beneath was not as it should be. The leatherworker remained mostly still, though his breath stuttered slightly with each deeper touch. Arlen could feel the muscles tighten, not in alarm but in quiet defense. When he withdrew his hand and reached for the horn cup, the man's eyes followed the motion, not with fear, but with trust edged by caution. Arlen had earned that kind of gaze over years, not with words but with consistency. He lit a small beeswax candle and warmed the cup just slightly, enough to draw the skin gently when applied. It would not cure the pain, but it would show him where the blood pooled, where heat gathered, where imbalance brewed. As he placed the cup over the tender spot and let it draw, the man exhaled again, this time with relief. Sometimes the pain of suction distracted from the ache within. Sometimes it made the invisible speak. They waited in silence. Outside, the sounds of the town passed like clouds. Wheels turning over stone, hooves echoing against the alley, a shout of greeting followed by laughter. The leatherworker glanced toward the shuttered window, as if reminded that the world continued even as pain lingered. Arlen took the opportunity to speak, not of diagnosis, not yet, but of memory. "You came to me once," he said, "after a knife caught your palm, nearly sliced through the tendons." The man nodded. "2 winters ago." He smiled faintly. "You stitched it faster than I could apologize." Arlen allowed a soft breath of laughter, just enough to soften the space between them. It was important, he had learned, to remind patients they had histories, not just symptoms. Pain could erase identity, especially the kind that crept in slowly, quietly, refusing to name itself. "Do you still feel it when you grip the awl?" Arlen asked. The man flexed his fingers. "A little," he said, "but not enough to stop me." Another pause. This is different." His hand rested again on his abdomen. "It doesn't leave when I rest. It follows me." Arlen removed the cup gently and examined the skin beneath. A faint red circle had formed. Angry, warm to the touch, but not inflamed in the way that warned of rupture or rot. He sat back and folded his hands. "It may be the bowel," he said calmly. "Twisted slightly, or slow to move. It has not hardened. That's good." The man looked at him, not alarmed, but expectant. "And if it worsens?" he asked. Arlen paused before replying, not to worry him, but to be sure of his own words. "If it sharpens or spreads, we'll draw it out. There are methods." He did not describe them. There was no need to speak of bloodletting or incisions just yet. "But for now," Arlen continued, "rest. You must stop bending at the waist. No heavy lifting. Boiled barley and soft greens only. I'll prepare a tincture to ease the pressure and heat. Drink it morning and night, and chew fennel after eating." The man nodded, not because he understood the science, there was little to understand, but because Arlen's voice held the kind of certainty that came from quiet repetition, not pride. That was enough for now. Arlen moved to the shelf where his tinctures rested, selecting a dark glass vial that held a mixture of chamomile, ground anise, and a touch of wormwood, all steeped in warmed wine 2 nights past. The herbs had settled to the bottom, their remnants swirling gently when disturbed. He poured a portion into a small clay flask, stoppered it with care, and wrapped it in cloth to protect it from breaking. As he handed it to the leatherworker, their fingers touched briefly, an accidental brush, but one not without meaning. In that small contact, a kind of unspoken contract passed between them. "I will do what I can, and you will try to heal." The man looked down at the flask, cradling it like something more fragile than it was, then tucked it gently into the inside pocket of his coat. "How much do I owe?" he asked, though he knew the answer. Arlen only shook his head once. "Bring me a length of good cord when your hands are steady again. The kind that doesn't fray." The leatherworker smiled, not wide, but true. "Done," he said. No coin passed between them, only trust. Before the man left, Arlen offered one final instruction, softer than the rest. "If it sharpens suddenly, do not wait." He said it not with warning, but with care, like someone leaving a candle burning in a dark room. The leatherworker nodded and pulled his cloak around him. "You'll know," he said. "You always seem to." He stepped out into the street with the same measured step he had arrived with, though now there was something else in it. A shift, slight but real. Whether it was hope or simply the comfort of being seen, Arlen couldn't say. He stood at the threshold for a moment, watching the man disappear into the mist, now thinning as morning wore on. Around him, the street had begun to fill. A woman with a limp passed carrying a sack of flour. A child trailed behind her, dragging a stick through the puddles. The town was fully awake, and pain, as always, was moving quietly among its people, unnoticed by most. But Arlen noticed. That was his task. Not to fix everything, not to promise cure, but to see what others could not or would not, and to meet it with presence. He returned inside and closed the door gently behind him, letting the latch click into place with a soft finality. There were no shouts, no applause, no ceremony. Only the quiet satisfaction of having given someone back a piece of their day, perhaps even a night without pain. In his notebook, Arlen made a record. Leather worker, south wall. Abdominal tension, left side. Warm pulse, soft tissue. Prescribed fennel and light tincture. He paused a moment, then added, tired eyes. Spoke little. Pain long carried. It was not a medical note, but it mattered all the same. He believed the body held on to stories, and that symptoms were sometimes just forgotten pages asking to be read aloud. As he capped the inkwell and folded the book closed, the knock he'd just answered already felt like a memory. But in that memory lived something sacred. One man, one morning, one brief exchange of trust. And that, for Arlen, was enough to continue. Chapter 4. Walking the streets, sickness in the shadows. The doctor stepped outside once more, letting the worn door close quietly behind him as he turned toward the heart of the town. The morning fog had lifted, leaving behind a thin, pearlescent sheen on the cobblestones, as though the air itself had been washed clean by light. Yet beneath that gentle shine, Arlen knew. The town breathed in layers, some visible, others hidden. The main street was now bustling. Merchants called from behind their stalls, the scents of garlic, cheese, and salted meat colliding with the sharper tang of tanned leather and the iron musk of old tools. The clang of a hammer echoed from a smithy on the far end of the square. Chickens darted between carts. But what drew Arlen's eye was none of this. He walked with the grace of someone who belonged more to the spaces between things. The alleyways where chimney smoke hung low, where mold clung to plastered walls, where eyes peered from behind cracked shutters. It was there, in the half-light and the lingering shadows, that illness often made its home. He passed by the well, where two women argued gently about who had arrived first with their buckets. One wore a shawl so thin it may as well have been a whisper. Arlen glanced at her hands, red from cold, cracked along the knuckles, and made a quiet mental note. Not urgent, but worth remembering. Further on, a boy sat on a stoop, his legs bare despite the cool air. He coughed once, not dramatically, but with a tightness that caught Arlen's attention. His mother, sweeping nearby, glanced up with tired eyes and gave a quick, apologetic nod. Arlen returned the nod with understanding and continued on. He knew better than to interrupt a rhythm of dignity too early. Sometimes people came to him, sometimes they needed time, and sometimes they chose silence because it was the only power they had left. As he turned a corner toward the back lanes, the noise of the market faded, replaced by the quieter signs of daily endurance. A bucket tipped over in a hurry, a door left ajar for air, a dog asleep beneath a window where someone had burned lavender. This was the part of the day he seldom spoke of, the walking, the watching, the slow cataloging of shadows. It was not a time of treatment, but of observation. The streets themselves became a kind of patient, each crack in the plaster a wound, each bundle of herbs hung from a lintel a preventative measure from a mother or midwife. Arlen paused near a doorway where someone had scattered dried rosemary along the step, a charm against fever, if one believed such things. He bent and touched it lightly with 2 fingers, not to disturb it, but to acknowledge it. In places like this, healing was as much ritual as remedy. He moved on. Behind the bakery, the scent of yeast and ash mixed with the sharper smell of rot from a barrel not yet cleared. He stepped over a rivulet of gray water running from a butcher's drain and looked up to see a woman watching him from a window above. Their eyes met. She said nothing, but tilted her head slightly toward the house next door. Arlen understood. He nodded once and turned toward the door. The door creaked open without resistance, revealing a dim corridor that smelled of damp wood and overboiled broth. It was not a home of wealth or comfort. Rather, one of those narrow, leaning houses common along the older edge of town, where families often lived 2 or 3 to a floor, sharing not just space but worry. Arlen entered slowly, giving the shadows time to recede from his presence. In such places, light was a guest that arrived only briefly each day. A girl of perhaps 12 met him at the foot of a crooked staircase. Her eyes were wary, but not afraid. She had likely seen him before, through windows, perhaps, or from behind her mother's skirts. Without a word, she turned and began to climb. Her steps were quiet but quick, practiced from repetition. Arlen followed at a respectful distance, one hand trailing lightly against the wall, as much for balance as for contact. These walls had heard things: the silence of pain, the echo of argument, the breathless rush of someone calling for help. He could almost feel it. At the top of the stairs, she gestured toward a half-open door and then vanished back down without explanation. Inside, the room was dark except for a sliver of window letting in a shaft of pale light. The bed was small and low to the ground, barely more than straw beneath a thin wool blanket. Upon it lay a woman, middle-aged, gaunt, her skin pale with a slight yellowish tinge. Her eyes opened as Arlen approached, and he saw in them not fear, but fatigue deepened by days of discomfort. Her lips parted, but no words came out at first. He knelt beside her and placed 2 fingers gently on her wrist, feeling the flutter of her pulse, weak but steady. Her breath came shallow, not ragged but measured, as if conserving energy between each word. "The belly," she whispered finally, "and the head." Arlen nodded once and brushed a few strands of hair from her forehead. It was damp with sweat, not from fever, but from effort. Illness here was not sudden or violent. It was slow, creeping, the kind that wore a person down like water on stone. That he asked no questions immediately. Instead, he opened the shutters slightly to let more light in, then rolled up his sleeves and unpacked his pouch in silence. A candle was already lit in the corner of the room, its flame barely flickering in the stillness. Arlen lit another near the bedside, not for visibility, but to mark the space, to create a boundary between the outer world and the small room where time moved differently. He examined her abdomen with care, pressing lightly, watching her face, listening for what she did not say. He noticed the faint rise of her ribs with each breath, the subtle tension in her shoulders, the way her hand gripped the edge of the blanket when he touched a particularly tender spot. "How long?" he asked softly. 5 days, she replied after a pause. "No food, only broth, and it does not stay." He looked around. A bowl in the corner held the remnants of that broth. Nothing spoiled, but the scent suggested it had been reheated more than once. Arlen made another note in his mind. Not just illness, but poverty. Not just pain, but isolation. Arlen reached for a small pouch tucked deep in his satchel, one reserved for cases like this, where the body had grown too weary to fight alone. Inside were carefully wrapped parcels of dried fennel, ground cumin, crushed coriander, and a powder of boiled plum skin reduced to fine dust. These were not rare ingredients, but they were selected with care and preserved in the right season, their balance tested by years of trial, success, and quiet failures. He mixed a portion of each into a warm infusion from the water pot near the hearth, letting the scent rise and settle over the small room. It was sweet, bitter, and grounding. As the steam curled around them, he watched her breath steady slightly, drawn by the warmth more than the smell. He helped her sit upright with gentle hands, propping her back with a folded cloak from the end of the bed. She drank slowly, pausing after each sip, as if swallowing small stones. But she drank, and when she finished, she closed her eyes and leaned her head against the wall. "That is good," she whispered. Her fingers relaxed, just slightly, upon the edge of the blanket. He did not press her to speak more. Words would come in their time or not at all. Instead, he cleaned the small wooden bowl, tucked the unused herbs away, and dipped a linen cloth in rosewater to wipe her forehead and palms. It was not a necessary treatment by medical standards, but Arlen knew it mattered. To be touched without demand, to be cooled gently when the world had been heat and dryness and ache for days. This was a kind of medicine no scroll had ever taught him. The body responded to kindness, sometimes even more than to tincture or knife. As he worked, he looked around the room again. There were no icons on the walls, no dried herbs hanging from beams, no candle stubs collected for prayers. Only a basket of laundry half folded and a chipped comb resting atop a cracked mirror. This was a life interrupted, not collapsed, but paused by illness, waiting to resume once strength returned. He placed a wrapped sachet near the bowl. "Steep this in broth," he said. "Once in the morning, once at dusk." She nodded without opening her eyes. Before he left, he took her hand again, not to check her pulse, but to anchor her to the moment. "You are not forgotten," he said. It was not a blessing or a promise. It was a fact. In a town where illness often passed unnoticed unless it cried aloud. He wanted her to know she had been seen, acknowledged, and remembered. She did not answer, but her mouth twitched faintly, perhaps toward a smile, or perhaps simply toward sleep. Arlen stepped back quietly, gathered his tools, and exited the room as gently as he had entered. The girl waited for him at the stairs. "Will she—" she began, then paused. Arlen met her eyes. "She has strength," he said, "and now something to help." The girl nodded, satisfied not with certainty, but with sincerity. That for now would be enough. Outside, the sun had begun its descent, casting long shadows across the alley and giving the air a golden hue. Arlen took a slow breath and continued on his way. The streets still whispered, and where there were whispers, there was work. Chapter 5. The Apothecary Visit, Gathering Remedies. The apothecary's shop sat nestled beneath the shadow of the old bell tower, where the stone of the buildings turned a soft golden hue by midday, and the streets narrowed just enough to hush the outside world. It was a quiet place, one of those curious corners of the town that seemed to resist time. Even the ivy growing along its upper wall had remained unchanged for years, holding fast like a green signature against the gray mortar. Arlen approached it as he always did, without fanfare, without knocking. Pushing the thick wooden door open to the familiar creak and the warm rush of fragrance that always met him first. Lavender, camphor, crushed petals, and something older still, the scent of age and pages and preserved thought. Inside, the shop was dim, lit mostly by the filtered daylight that fell through a stained glass window high above the shelves. The light painted long ribbons of color across the floorboards, where motes of dust danced like sleepy spirits. The air felt thick, not unpleasantly so, but with the gentle weight of intention. Everything in the room had purpose. Shelves lined every wall, rising to the ceiling and bending slightly with the age of their burden. Glass jars filled with dried roots, corked bottles of oil, cloth sachets of crushed flowers, and ceramic pots with handwritten labels in Latin and Old Church script stood like guardians of secret knowledge. A large oak counter ran along the back wall, behind which sat a man not quite as old as the shop, but close in soul. His name was Tolan, and though he called himself an apothecary, he had once studied the stars before deciding that herbs were more predictable than planets. His robes were always slightly stained, his spectacles perched permanently on the end of his nose, and his voice, a low, thoughtful hum, seemed to echo even when he whispered. He looked up as Arlen entered, smiling not with surprise, but recognition. "You walk quietly," Tolan said, brushing a hand across the surface of his open ledger. "A trait I admire in physicians. Illness is loud enough on its own." Arlen returned the smile and stepped closer, removing his gloves and placing them gently beside a bundle of folded parchment. "I need burdock root," he said quietly, "and angelica, if it's fresh." Tolan nodded without question. He knew better than to ask why. Arlen did not waste herbs, not even the bitter ones. As Tolan turned to gather the items, Arlen moved along the side wall, letting his fingers trail across the shelves, not touching, but remembering. Each jar told a story. The blue bottle with the dried sage was harvested during the summer of the great storm, when the fields near the monastery nearly drowned. The small pot of orris root still smelled faintly of violets, even through its wax seal. And there, tucked behind the ginger, was a tiny vial of poppy resin. Dangerous in the wrong hands, precious in the right ones. He did not reach for it. Not today. Instead, he focused on the simpler medicines, things that soothed rather than silenced. As Tolan returned with a tray of carefully wrapped bundles, Arlen studied them one by one, checking texture, color, even the way they crumbled beneath pressure. A good remedy began with good material, and a good doctor never assumed anything without testing for himself. Tolan, now leaning across the counter with his elbows on the stained wood, observed Arlen with that familiar mixture of respect and curiosity, as though watching a fellow craftsman test the grain of a well-shaped bow. "You always take your time," he said, not accusingly, but almost with fondness. Arlen gave a faint nod without looking up. "Time reveals the difference between a remedy and a guess," he replied. His fingers paused over the angelica root, long, gnarled, with a rich amber hue where it split at the center. He broke off a sliver, pressed it between his fingers, and brought it briefly to his nose. The scent was sharp, earthy, slightly sweet, good, still potent. He laid it aside gently and reached for the burdock, unwrapping the cloth with the same attention one might give to scripture. These roots were more than medicine, they were memory. Every texture carried the weather in which it had grown. Every scent the hands that had touched it. Arlen believed that healing began before the patient. It began here in quiet places, where herbs were chosen not just for their names, but for their readiness. Tolan busied himself at a side shelf, preparing a small blend Arlen often used for digestive troubles. Fennel, caraway, and lemon balm, ground together in the mortar shaped like a curled horn. The rhythm of pestle against stone filled the room in soft, slow strokes, like a heartbeat turned inward. "You've been walking," Tolan said after a while. It was not a question. He had noticed the faint trace of wet dust on the hem of Arlen's cloak, the slight dampness along the seams of his satchel, and the subtle fatigue in his stance, not exhaustion, but the particular weariness that came from moving through the world with open senses. "To the southern quarter," Arlen confirmed. "An older woman, alone, liver weakness, and before that a leather worker, internal ache, not yet turned. Still time." Tolan hummed, but said nothing more. In their years of quiet collaboration, he had learned that the best conversations between doctors and apothecaries were those that asked nothing and assumed less. Their words were not for gossip, but for mapping the outlines of need. When the herbs were packed and the scroll of prices prepared, though Arlen would likely barter for most of it later, Tolan laid one final item on the counter, wrapped in soft wool. Arlen raised a brow. "You've been saving that," he said. "For weeks." Tolan shrugged. "I trust your hands more than most." Arlen unfolded the cloth to reveal a dark brown glass bottle, tinted to block light, sealed with wax and string. Inside was a tincture of valerian root and skullcap, aged 2 full cycles beneath controlled warmth. It was not common stock. This was a tonic not just for the restless body, but for those whose minds would not quiet even in sleep. "The brewer's daughter?" Tolan asked. Arlen nodded once. "If she'll take it." Tolan allowed himself a rare sigh. "So young," he murmured. "Too young to carry shadows." Arlen rewrapped the bottle and slid it into the protected pouch of his satchel. "They come to all of us," he said. "Youth only delays their arrival." Tolan said nothing more. In the silence, they exchanged no coins, only glances, weighted by years of shared effort. Arlen turned toward the door. "I'll return before the moon shifts," he said. "If not, set aside more comfrey." And with that, he stepped back into the street, where the sun had begun to tilt westward, and the town's shadows lengthened once more. The street outside had changed in the time Arlen spent within the apothecary's quiet walls. The light had grown gentler, filtering down between eaves and overhangs like ribbons of honey, and the clamor of morning had softened into a more measured hum. Vendors had begun packing up their stalls, brushing fruit skins and crumbs from linen cloths. Children, no longer running, now crouched in corners drawing with sticks in the dirt. The tempo of the town was shifting, afternoons slow turning toward dusk. Arlen walked with his satchel balanced over one shoulder, feeling the weight of the new remedies at his side. Each root, each tincture carried within it a story yet to unfold. Someone, perhaps many, would need these in the days ahead. And yet the doctor never rushed. His pace was steady, almost ceremonial. To walk too fast in his profession was to miss things. Signs in posture, subtle changes in the air, a smell of illness that clung beneath the fragrance of soap or herbs. Healing did not begin at the bedside. It began in motion, in walking, in watching, in arriving with presence. As he passed beneath a crumbling archway near the old fountain, Arlen paused. A woman sat there alone, her skirts pulled tightly around her legs, one arm wrapped across her middle. She was not old, though her eyes had the distance of someone who had waited too long without help. Arlen stepped close, but not too close, letting his shadow fall gently beside hers. "Are you in pain?" he asked quietly. The woman nodded once. "It comes and goes," she said. "More often now, like something curling inside me." Her voice was dry, her breath shallow, and her skin held that pale sheen he had seen too often in women who had carried more than their bodies could bear. Too many children, too many hard seasons, too many nights without warmth. Arlen crouched beside her, setting his satchel on the worn stone. "May I?" he asked, gesturing gently to her hand. She nodded, and he took it with the same care he used with old scrolls, slow, steady, reverent. Her fingers were cool, her pulse erratic. Something beneath the surface, certainly, not yet dangerous but far from distant. From his satchel, he removed a pouch of angelica, the same he had tested earlier in the apothecary, and a linen packet of fennel and mint. "Steep this in water," he said, "twice daily. No cold food. Rest as much as you're able." She blinked at him, not quite nodding, but not refusing either. "I've no coin," she whispered. Arlen shook his head. "I didn't ask for any." He placed the bundle in her lap. "But if it helps," he added, "tell others what helped you. That will be more useful than silver." The woman held the herbs as if uncertain whether they were real. Her eyes glistened, but she did not weep. Arlen stood, nodding once before moving on. Behind him, the fountain gurgled faintly, spilling moss-dark water into a stone basin where someone had dropped a single copper coin. Whether it was for luck or for health, he didn't know. But it gleamed in the sunlight all the same, small, simple, honest. Like most of what Arlen carried. Chapter 6. The Monastery Garden, quiet among herbs and psalms. By the time Arlen reached the monastery gates, the sun had dipped far enough west to throw long, golden beams across the cloister walls. The stone glowed with the heat of memory, warm from the day's sun but already cooling with evening's slow descent. The gates stood open, as they always were in daylight. Weathered oak reinforced with iron, aged with centuries of salt wind and prayer. No one stood guard, yet Arlen knew he was never unseen. The brothers watched quietly from shaded alcoves and beneath the arches of the inner yard, their robes brushing gently against the flagstones as they moved between work and worship. The air here smelled different, cleaner, softer, a mixture of turned earth, damp stone, and 100 green things growing in patient silence. This was not just a place of faith, but of cultivation. The gardens beyond the chapel were legendary among healers for their rare plants, grown from seed brought by pilgrims and traders over many seasons. Some said the herbs here responded to prayer. Arlen did not know if that was true, but he knew they responded to care. He walked slowly through the wide inner courtyard, nodding respectfully to a passing monk who carried a basket of harvested sage. The man smiled faintly but did not speak, a shared understanding. Silence was often the first medicine here. Beyond the central fountain, where lilies floated on still water, the garden opened gently, divided into narrow plots by rows of stones and low hedges. Arlen stepped off the path and onto the soft, loamy soil between beds of feverfew and borage. Each plant had a marker etched in wood or stone, some in Latin, others in older, almost forgotten tongues. Bees floated lazily from flower to flower, their hum a kind of chant that merged with the low murmur of monks reciting vespers in the chapel beyond. This was why he had come, not for ceremony, but for renewal. Among the beds of thyme and marigold, Arlen found something he could not often access elsewhere, a moment untouched by urgency. Here pain was not knocking. No one waited behind a door. No child was gasping in the dark. Here the world exhaled. He moved toward the shaded eastern edge of the garden, where a canopy of trellised vines filtered the last of the sunlight into soft green shadow. There, nestled between two stone benches, stood the monastery's prized mandrake. Its roots gnarled and strange, its leaves broad and slightly silvered at the edges. Few outside the monastery walls ever saw it. Fewer still touched it. Arlen had once been granted that rare permission years ago, after tending to the abbot through a long fever that left him near death. The brothers believed the mandrake was sacred, its strange form too close to human to be merely botanical. Arlen respected the story, but he also respected the chemistry. The root, when properly dried and ground, could numb even the most stubborn pain, though too much could kill. It was not a herb for amateurs. He crouched beside it, not to harvest, but to observe. The soil was moist. The root looked healthy. It would not be needed today, but someday soon it might be. He stood, brushing soil from his hands, and allowed himself a rare smile. Here, among leaves and psalms, he felt time soften. Brother Olin emerged quietly from the far archway, robes tucked under one arm, and a shallow wicker basket in the other. He was younger than most of the order, his face still smooth despite the creases of quiet discipline that had begun to form near his brow. Arlen had known him since his novitiate, when Olin had stumbled through a recitation of plant names and mixed up hemlock with horehound. a dangerous but forgivable mistake. Now, years later, Olin's hands moved with the assured gentleness of someone who had learned not just the names, but the temperaments of each leaf and root. He approached without ceremony and extended the basket without speaking. Inside, wrapped in layered cloths, lay sprigs of wild betony, 3 whole comfort stalks freshly cut, and a small bundle of tightly knotted yarrow flowers. Arlen accepted it with a brief nod of gratitude, already noting the healthy sheen on the leaves, the even cut of the stalks. "Brother Seren said you might stop by," Olin said softly. "The fever along the riverbank hasn't returned." Arlen nodded again, pleased but unsurprised. "Clean water and clean hands," he said. "Not miracles, but close." They walked together between the rows of foxglove and tansy, their footsteps muffled by the rich earth. Olin spoke sparingly, which Arlen appreciated. In this place, silence was not absence, but fullness. Words arrived only when they had meaning. "The mandrake is holding well," Olin offered after a time, glancing back toward the shaded vine trellis. "Brother Alric says it flowered early this season." Arlen raised an eyebrow. "Then we should expect an early frost." The old saying was more proverb than fact, but still it carried the tone of weathered truth. They paused near a stone bench where a jar of olive oil sat steeping with rosemary in the sun, its golden hue catching the light like stained glass. "We've begun pressing balm for the winter stores," Olin said. "But the bees are thin this year." Arlen crouched to inspect the jar, lifting it briefly and swirling the contents. The fragrance was strong, clean, free of mold or debris. "A few more days," he said, "then strain and store in dark bottles. Not the ones from the eastern cellar. They still hold the memory of vinegar." Olin smiled slightly. "You remember everything." Arlen did not answer. He only set the jar down gently and stood at the edge of the garden. The bells began to toll for the 6th hour. Not loud, not urgent, just enough to remind the brothers of the shape of the day. Arlen turned his gaze toward the chapel, where a line of robed figures now entered beneath the stone arch, their hands folded, their steps in rhythm. Olin would soon join them, and so Arlen placed a hand briefly on the younger man's shoulder. An old gesture of blessing, used long before words had replaced touch. "Thank you," he said. Olin nodded, understanding that it was not for the herbs alone, but for the quiet, for the soil, for the steadiness of this place in a world often tilting. Arlen turned and began the walk back through the rows, past the fig tree with its bent limbs, past the basin of still water where a dragonfly hovered motionless in the warm light. Each step back toward the town carried with it not urgency, but quiet purpose. The satchel at his side was heavier now, but his heart lighter. Among the monks, the herbs, and the psalms, he had remembered again that healing did not always begin with a cure. Sometimes it began with stillness. As Arlen exited the cloistered garden and passed once more beneath the outer arch, the change in the air was immediate. The hush of sacred ground gave way to the soft stirrings of ordinary life, the clip of sandals on stone, the murmur of distant voices, the faint smell of cooking fires carried on the breeze. Yet he did not rush. His steps remained slow, unbothered, as though he carried some of the stillness of the garden with him. That was, after all, the purpose of visiting such a place. Not to escape the world, but to carry something back into it. The herbs in his satchel now included more than roots and leaves. They carried the memory of quiet footsteps between prayer beds, the warmth of filtered sunlight across rosemary sprigs, and the unspoken assurance that there were places where time bowed its head and passed gently. As he re-entered the winding outer lanes of town, Arlen let his fingers trail across the garden wall one last time, feeling the roughness of the stone beneath his touch. In a world full of uncertainty, texture mattered. It reminded the hands of where they'd been. The late afternoon had deepened. Shadows stretched longer now, tracing crooked lines across the cobbled streets like veins beneath translucent skin. Arlen noted the changes with practiced awareness. Shutters closed earlier in the poor quarters to keep in warmth. Laundry pulled from lines before dusk's dampness crept in. Bread sellers packing unsold loaves back into baskets with a care that betrayed more worry than waste. He passed a boy tending a goat with a limp, its left rear leg dragging slightly, the hoof cracked from wear. The boy looked up, wide-eyed but unafraid, and Arlen offered a small nod. Tomorrow, perhaps, he would stop and teach the boy how to soften the hoof with warm ash and beeswax. But not now. The boy nodded back, as if understanding the promise without words. Arlen continued on. At a crossroads, he saw a woman sorting through a basket of bruised pears. She did not glance up, but he knew her face. She had once brought him her husband in the middle of the night, pale and choking from a winter chill. Arlen had stayed until dawn, holding a cloth to his chest and waiting, breath by breath, for the worst to pass. He turned down a narrower lane, where houses leaned inward as if whispering secrets across the rooftops. Here, the ground was more uneven, the air tinged with mildew and coal smoke, but also something sweeter. The faint scent of thyme crushed beneath someone's boots, the trail of lavender oil left behind on a doorframe by an old woman who believed it kept illness from crossing her threshold. Arlen slowed as he passed her home. The scent was fresh. She had reapplied it that morning. It meant she still hoped, and hope in this part of town was not a small thing. As he approached the final bend that would lead him back toward his own quarters, the bells at the monastery struck once more, this time for none but themselves. No prayers now, only the marking of time, a soft reminder that even in the sacred, minutes must pass. Arlen listened, then breathed deeply. He had work still to do, roots to sort, powders to portion, tinctures to stir. But for now he simply walked, present, calm, and whole. Chapter 7. Evening Remedies, Quiet Hands, Quiet Minds. The light within Arlen's quarters was different in the evening, softer, more golden, the way old paper glows when kissed by the last breath of the sun. His room was modest by any measure. A cot in the corner with a woven wool blanket, a single wooden chair that had lost its varnish years ago, and a narrow work table that bore the true soul of the space. Upon that table lay the tools of his quiet trade. Glass jars with stained corks, strips of cloth rolled with dried leaves, a candle stub melted into the curve of a stone dish, and a thick-bound notebook covered in ink and fingerprint smudges. Everything had its place, and yet nothing was untouched by use. This was not a room meant for show, but for doing, for preparing, mixing, grinding, boiling, and occasionally hoping. Arlen moved without hurry, his cloak already hung by the door, his hands washed with rosewater and ash soap. He rolled up his sleeves, took a deep breath, and began the ritual of evening remedy-making, the kind that required as much listening to silence as it did knowledge of herbs. The small iron kettle he used for steeping sat upon a circle of flat stones, warmed by the glowing coals beneath. He filled it halfway with fresh water drawn from the well that morning, not yet touched by chill. Into it he added a small handful of lemon balm, just enough to scent the room, and 2 slices of dried pear for sweetness. This was not for medicine, but for the air itself, to calm the room and ready his mind. He watched the steam curl upward and then turned his attention to the patient bundles collected that day. From the apothecary, the angelica and burdock lay waiting in folded cloth. From the monastery, the comfrey, yarrow, and betony had already been rinsed and laid upon linen to dry. Each leaf and root had been chosen with intention. They were not to be tossed into a pot without thought, but paired carefully, their strengths balanced, their temperaments respected. He laid them out across the table as if arranging old friends for conversation. Some bold, some soft, all familiar in their own way, that he reached first for the comfrey, splitting the stalks with a practiced twist, revealing the thick, mucilaginous center that would draw inflammation from weary joints and bones. This he set into a mortar, adding a pinch of dried marigold petals, gathered in late spring for brightness and wound cleansing. He ground them slowly with the pestle, listening not only to the soft crunch of stem against stone, but to the silence that wrapped the room. It was in this stillness that Arlen found his clearest thought, not in debate or prescription, but in repetition. The press and twist, the lifting of spoon to jar, the wrapping of linen soaked in herb-laden oil, these were not chores. They were gestures of care. And as he worked, he thought of those he had seen that day, the leatherworker with the heaviness in his side, the woman in the alley wrapped in weariness, the girl at the monastery whose fingers had trembled when she touched the balm. They were not patients in his mind. They were stories. Each mixture he created was a page, an offering, not a solution. And in that offering, there was meaning. Outside his small window, dusk had deepened into a velvet hush, and the last call of a nightjar echoed once across the rooftops before fading into silence. Arlen lit a beeswax candle, its flame catching quickly with a quiet breath of life, and the warm glow painted soft amber shadows along the shelves. He set the candle near his notebook and returned to the task at hand. With a steady touch, he transferred the crushed comfrey and marigold into a small clay pot lined with olive oil. He stirred it slowly with a wooden spoon, watching the petals darken and the mixture thicken as it absorbed the plant's strength. This balm would cool inflammation, soothe skin, and offer the comfort of effort made in someone else's name. It was not grand medicine, not the kind sung of in courts or taught in distant universities, but it was useful and kind and ready. He sealed the pot with linen and twine, labeling it in neat script, "For aches. Cool storage. Apply with clean hands." Then he set it aside with care, as one might place a letter before it is delivered. He turned next to the yarrow, plucking each flower head gently and inspecting it beneath the candlelight. Yarrow was a plant of balance, neither too warming nor too cooling. It carried with it a quiet intelligence, a knowing. It stopped bleeding and opened breath. It soothed stomachs and lightened fevers. It was not flashy, but it was wise. Arlen bundled it loosely with fennel seeds and a pinch of dried orange peel, placing it in a linen sachet to be steeped later into tea. For a patient who could not rest, for someone who refused to slow, the kind of soul who worked through illness until collapse. He thought of the woman who had leaned against the wall that morning, holding her stomach as if she feared it would betray her. He would bring her this tea tomorrow, and she would pretend not to need it. But she would drink it eventually. They always did in time. Not because he insisted, but because his presence had left something behind, an invisible fingerprint on their routine. That was the quiet art of healing. Not to force change, but to invite it. As he tied the sachet and placed it alongside the balm, Arlen allowed himself a moment to breathe. Not simply to rest, but to notice. His own posture, the ache beginning to stir behind his eyes, the tightness in his lower back from standing too long without pause. He took a sip of the warm lemon balm and pear infusion from earlier, now steeped into sweetness, and let it rest on his tongue before swallowing. The herbs soothed him as they always had, not just in body, but in spirit. They reminded him of the earth, of seasons, of cycles far older than pain. They reminded him that even the healer must be tended to, or else the hands that offer care begin to tremble unseen. He reached for his notebook and opened it to a fresh page. With deliberate strokes, he wrote down the recipes he had crafted that evening, measurements, temperatures, timing. Then, beneath those notes, he added a quieter line. The mandrake holds. The river quarter is calmer. The girl at the steps drank her tea. He paused, then added, "And I am still here." It was enough. The candle's flame flickered gently now, casting long, slow-moving shadows along the wall, like memories pacing the edges of the room. Arlen set down his pen and closed the notebook with a soft thud, letting the ink dry without hurry. He stood slowly, feeling the quiet stiffness in his knees, and stretched his arms over his head until his spine offered a faint release. The day had etched itself into his body. Each visit, each conversation, each observation settling like fine dust across his muscles. He did not resent it. In fact, he welcomed the weight. It reminded him that he had been present, that he had moved through his world not as a passerby, but as a witness and participant in lives that, for a brief moment, had opened to him like windows unlatched on a windy afternoon. He turned toward the shelf where his personal teas were kept. Nothing potent, nothing to numb. Just herbs to carry him gently toward sleep. Tonight, he chose linden blossom and oat straw, with a single shaving of nutmeg tucked into the bottom of the cup. A humble mixture, but soft and grounding. While the water heated over the remaining coals, Arlen moved to the small window set into the stone wall. The town outside was quieter now. Rooftops silvered under the rising moon, chimneys puffing faint trails of smoke, and doorways darkened for the night. Somewhere nearby, someone was singing softly, a lullaby or perhaps a prayer, and the notes floated on the air like threads of old wool. He did not strain to hear the words. The melody alone was enough. Behind him, the kettle began to hiss, not boil, just a breath of readiness. He poured the water slowly over the tea blend, watching the steam rise and curl into the dim air. As the herbs unfurled in the cup, he carried it to his chair and sat, allowing the silence to settle around him like a second cloak. This was his final ritual, not for patience, not for records, but for himself. To drink something warm, to breathe slowly, to sit and let the day loosen its grip. He sipped carefully, the tea soft on his tongue, and let his eyes close for a moment. In that stillness, he could feel the rhythm of the town's sleep begin. His mind wandered, not anxiously but curiously, revisiting small fragments of the day. The worn fingertips of the leather worker, still ink-stained from repairing saddles. The tremble in the old woman's hand as she held her tincture. The sound of Brother Olin's voice naming each herb with quiet pride. These memories came not as burdens, but as gentle reassurances that his work, though simple, mattered. That each task, grinding a root, steeping a leaf, offering a touch, had created ripples, subtle but real. He took another sip, slower now, and allowed himself to imagine tomorrow, not with dread, but with readiness. There would be more doors, more voices, more unseen aches brought into the light, and he would walk through them with the same steady steps, not to cure the world, but to meet it kindly, one patient at a time. Outside, the wind shifted slightly, and the scent of wood smoke drifted in through the cracks in the shutter. Arlen breathed it in, placed the empty cup on the table, and rose to blow out the candle. Darkness wrapped around him like linen, soft and complete. He was ready for sleep. Chapter 8. Night Calls, When Sleep Must Wait. The knock came just as Arlen's eyes had closed, soft but insistent. A steady rhythm of 3 taps, followed by silence. In the stillness of his quarters, it rang louder than it was, breaking through the veil of rest like a single drop into calm water. He opened his eyes without surprise. A night without interruption was a rarity. He rose from his cot slowly, joints stiff from the day's labor, and reached for his cloak draped over the chair. The air had grown colder since sunset, and the chill pressed against the stone walls with familiar persistence. He lit a small oil lamp and made his way to the door, unlocking it with a quiet click. On the other side stood a boy, no older than 10, barefoot, his hair damp with sweat, and his breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. "It's my mother," the boy said without preamble. "She can't wake up proper." His eyes were wide but steady, the kind that had seen too much too young. Arlen placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "You did well to come," he said gently. "Take me to her." Arlen moved quickly but calmly, collecting his satchel and checking its contents by feel more than sight. A vial of valerian, clean cloths, 2 wrapped tinctures, 1 sachet of fever balm, and the small horn spoon he kept for emergency doses. He slipped the oil lamp into its leather loop and stepped outside, the door swinging shut behind him. The town was hushed beneath the moon. Rooftops silvered and windows shuttered, the occasional gust of wind rattling loose shutters or stirring the scent of firewood and chimney ash. The boy led the way without speaking, feet slapping lightly on the cobblestones, guiding Arlen through alleys too narrow for carts and streets too forgotten for regular patrols. These were the hidden parts of the town, the parts that didn't appear on maps, but which Arlen knew just as well. He moved with certainty, ducking low-hanging beams, stepping around sleeping dogs and puddles that reflected the lamplight like tiny pools of gold. Their destination, he suspected, was close. Desperation rarely traveled far before turning inward. They reached a narrow house with a sagging lintel and a door made from mismatched boards. The boy pushed it open without knocking, and Arlen ducked inside. The room was dark but warm, the air thick with the smell of wood smoke, unwashed cloth, and something sharper, sickness. A woman lay on a thin mattress near the hearth, her body curled into itself, hands twisted into the fabric of her blanket. She was breathing, but only just, each breath shallow, lips parted, brow damp. Arlen knelt beside her, setting down his satchel and touching her forehead. Fever, not the slow-building kind, but the sudden spike of something fierce, perhaps an infection, perhaps exhaustion finally turned inward. He turned to the boy. "Did she eat today?" The boy hesitated, then shook his head. "Only water. I tried to make porridge, but—" His voice trailed off, and Arlen nodded gently. "You did more than many would," he said. Then, without further word, he opened his satchel and began. His movements were quiet, precise, measured not by panic, but by practiced urgency. Sleep would wait. Arlen's hands moved almost on their own, guided by habit, by instinct honed over years of tending to illness in rooms like this, dim, too quiet, and edged with uncertainty. He unrolled a small bundle of cloth and withdrew a vial no larger than a child's finger, filled with a syrupy tincture of elderflower and fever balm. He dipped the horn spoon and brought it carefully to the woman's lips, coaxing it between them with the soft patience of someone who knows that time, now, flows differently. Her throat moved, once, twice, as she swallowed, and Arlen waited, counting slow beats in his mind. He turned to the hearth and stirred the fire gently with the iron poker, coaxing the embers into a low, glowing flame. The warmth would help. Fever did not fear cold, it fed on it. A second spoonful followed, this one mixed with a thread of willow bark, bitterness balanced by the elderflower's subtle sweetness. She winced as she swallowed, but it was a good sign. The body still responsive. The boy had crouched in the corner, watching without sound, arms wrapped tightly around his knees. "What happened before she slept?" Arlen asked, not harshly, but with the tone of someone preparing a map for memory. The boy shrugged slightly. "She was tired," said. The light hurt her eyes. "She didn't eat. She said she just needed to rest. But then I came back and she wouldn't speak." His voice cracked at the end, and he looked away, ashamed of something he could not name. Arlen crossed the room slowly and knelt beside him. "You did the right thing," he said softly. "You brought someone. That's more than many know to do." The boy nodded, barely. Arlen returned to the bedside and checked the woman's pulse again. Slower now, not fading, but resting. He wrapped a damp cloth around her wrists, cooling gently, and sprinkled a few drops of lavender oil across the pillow. The scent, he knew, wouldn't cure anything, but it might help her breathe more deeply, might ease the path into healing sleep. Sometimes that was all that could be done. Sometimes that was enough that he remained by her side for the better part of an hour, checking her temperature, wiping her brow, speaking softly to anchor her drifting consciousness. Her breathing deepened by degrees, and though she never opened her eyes, her body seemed to ease, shoulders no longer clenched, fingers uncurled. When Arlen was satisfied she was resting, he stood and crossed to the small table in the corner. A cracked cup and an empty water jug stood there like sentinels of quiet neglect. He refilled the jug from the pitcher in his satchel, an emergency supply always carried, and poured the boy a cup. "You'll need to watch her," he said gently. "She may wake confused. Just remind her you're there, and keep her warm. If she wakes before dawn, give her water. Then rest yourself." The boy accepted the cup without speaking, but with both hands. It was a heavy night, but not a hopeless one. Arlen packed his things slowly, not out of reluctance, but care. Every movement signaled that nothing more was required for now. He paused at the door. "If she worsens, send again," he said. "But I think she'll see the morning." And with that, he stepped back into the night, leaving warmth and shadow behind. The town had grown quieter still as Arlen walked back through its narrow passages, his lamp casting a soft, golden arc before him that seemed to make the darkness lean away rather than flee. It was not truly late, by monastery measure. The night was still young, but the air had turned cold enough to sting gently at his cheeks, and even the taverns had quieted, their windows dim and voices inside hushed or gone entirely. Somewhere a shutter creaked lazily on its hinge, and the distant clang of a horseshoe against stone rang out once and then vanished into the silence. Arlen walked without urgency, though fatigue pressed gently against the backs of his eyes. He knew that rushing would not bring him rest. He was still filled with the presence of the room he had just left, the scent of the hearth smoke in the mother's blanket, the boy's wide, watching gaze, the steady rhythm of breath returning to the still figure on the mattress. These impressions moved with him like shadows clinging softly to his shoulders. He did not try to shrug them off. They were part of his craft. As he turned onto a quieter street that led back to his own quarters, he let his thoughts unwind in quiet procession. Each patient was a thread in the larger fabric of his day, and Arlen had long since learned to trace those threads backward in his mind before letting them go. It was a kind of prayer, though he would not have called it that, a reckoning with effort, a soft inventory of what had been done, what remained. He thought again of the woman from earlier, her forehead warm and skin pale. There had been strength left in her pulse, and the fever had not sunk too deeply. If the tincture held, and the boy kept her warm, she would likely wake with weariness but not danger. Still, he knew too well how illness could turn in the small hours, when the body's defenses grew thin and dreams tangled with pain. He had seen too many patients slip between dusk and dawn, despite every effort. That knowledge was never far, even on nights when the outcome seemed sure. Especially on those nights. He passed a window where candlelight still glowed faintly behind linen curtains. A silhouette moved gently within, perhaps a seamstress finishing a final stitch, or a father rocking a restless child. He did not look long. Some moments were not meant to be studied. Instead, he continued on until the familiar shape of his door came into view, its frame slightly warped from years of damp and shifting stone. He pushed it open with a creak and stepped inside, greeted by the last traces of warmth from the hearth and the faint smell of herbs lingering in the air. The candle he had snuffed before leaving sat on the table, untouched, its wick slightly bent like a figure mid-bow. He removed his cloak and set the satchel down with practiced care, then sat at the edge of the cot, unrolling his shoulders and pressing his palms into his thighs. He would not write tonight, not yet. He simply breathed. Around him, the room held still. It did not ask for anything. The walls offered no judgment. His tools remained silent. It was enough for now to have returned. Sleep would come, and if it did not, he would still rest. Stillness, after all, was its own kind of medicine. Chapter 9. Memories of the Academy. Lessons never left. In the quiet hours before dawn, when even the wind had grown still and the stars blinked like slow thoughts above the rooftops, Arlen found himself staring at the low ceiling beams of his room, sleep just out of reach. His body was tired, his limbs heavy, but his mind stirred gently beneath the surface. Neither anxious nor restless, simply awake. It happened sometimes after long days of tending others, as though the weight of care refused to settle even in stillness. On nights like these, when the candle had long since burned out and the only light came from memory, his thoughts would return, not to the patients of today, but to the corridors of yesterday, to the stone halls of the academy, to voices that had once shaped his own. He could almost hear the echo of footsteps on polished floors, the shuffle of parchment in tall stacks, the scratch of quills across vellum as young men tried to write down wisdom faster than it could be spoken. Those sounds were part of him still, carried like a second pulse in the quiet moments before dawn. He remembered the main hall first, a long corridor lined with busts of ancient physicians whose names had been chiseled into plaques in Latin. Most were forgotten now, their teachings buried under layers of new thought and revised understanding. But their stern eyes had once watched Arlen as he passed each day, their silence pressing lessons into his shoulders like invisible weights. One, in particular, stood near the door to the lecture chamber. Decimus Elias, known more for the stern shape of his stone brow than for any particular treatise. The students called him the judging head, and swore he could see who hadn't read the night's chapter. Arlen had never feared the busts, though. He had respected them, each one a reminder that medicine was not born from comfort, but from attention. Inside the chamber, long benches ran the length of the room, and on colder days, the scent of damp wool and ink mingled with candle soot. There, he had first heard the anatomy lectures, spoken by Master Rian, a man with a voice like dry oak bark and eyes that had seen more than he would ever tell. Master Rian had not coddled his students. He asked questions that were never easy, and when silence followed, he did not fill it with answers. Instead, he waited. Arlen remembered sitting in that chamber, pulse in his throat, as Rian stood with arms crossed, watching, always watching. "You cannot treat what you do not name," he once said, pacing slowly between the rows. "And you cannot name what you do not see." It was not only illness he meant, Arlen would later realize, but people. Symptoms were only the beginning. The patient's eyes, their breath, the way they held their hands, the places they didn't speak of, those were the truer signs. Rian had spoken of diagnosis like poetry and warned against the arrogance of certainty. "Be suspicious of ease," he would say. "Illness rarely makes itself simple." Arlen had taken those words with him long after the lectures ended. Even now, years and miles away from the academy's stone walls, he could feel them settle gently beside him like the brush of an old cloak. The lessons never left. They waited in the quiet, ready to be remembered. Arlen's thoughts moved next to the garden behind the academy, less structured than the monasteries, but no less sacred to those who studied there. It was a wild sort of place, bordered by low stone walls and left intentionally untamed, where medicinal herbs were allowed to grow as they would, mingling with weeds and wildflowers alike. Students were encouraged to wander through it daily, not simply to harvest but to observe how comfort curved in early frost, how feverfew wilted after heavy rain, how a single lavender stalk leaned toward the sun only after midday. Arlen had spent hours there, not always with purpose. Sometimes he sat on the bench beneath the gnarled pear tree just to breathe in the scent of damp earth and crushed rosemary underfoot. Other students rushed to memorize uses, doses, properties. Arlen listened instead. He learned how a leaf felt before it bloomed, how the underside of a nettle warned more than its sting. The garden did not speak in the language of charts and diagrams. It spoke in rhythm, season, and sensation, lessons that took longer to teach, but lingered far longer in the hands. It was there, in that quiet garden, that he had first met Alira. Not a fellow student, but a teacher from the apothecary across the square. She was older than Arlen by some years, though not so many as to feel unreachable, and she carried herself with a grace born of repetition. Alira taught with her fingers more than her voice, crushing roots, stirring powders, folding cloth in ways that preserved potency. Arlen had watched her work one morning with elder bark, her movements so fluid they seemed rehearsed by the seasons themselves. She had smiled when she noticed him staring and said, "The plants won't tell you anything if you keep treating them like strangers." That line had never left him. He later apprenticed with her in the evenings, tending shelves, grinding tinctures, labeling jars. She taught him the feel of rot before it showed, the smell of spoiled oil, the importance of silence when working with volatile herbs. But more than that, she taught him to notice, to sense when something in the mixture was resisting, when the proportions were out of rhythm even if not out of measure. Arlen remembered the day she left. Word had come that a fever had taken her sister in the east, and Alira packed her satchel with the same calm efficiency she brought to everything else. She left behind only a folded note and a tin of salve wrapped in wool. The note read, "Keep the rhythm. It knows more than you do." Arlen kept that tin for years, unopened, until the winter he ran out of balm for a child's burned hand. When he finally removed the lid, the scent of lavender and myrrh rose like a memory awakened. The salve worked better than any he'd since made himself. Even now, as he lay awake in the darkness of his room, he could almost smell it, soft, warm, healing. It was not just the knowledge she left him, but the presence of care carried in every gesture, that he had come to believe was the true inheritance of the academy. Not titles, not scrolls, but the touch of remembered hands, the echo of quiet teachers, and the sense that even in silence, someone once showed you the way. As the first gray edge of morning began to stretch across the sky, barely perceptible through the narrow window above his cot, Arlen remained lying in silence, his eyes open, not from restlessness but reverence. The recollections of the academy had not stirred regret in him, nor longing, but something gentler, gratitude. That place, with its austere stonework and cold floors, had somehow nurtured within him the capacity for warmth. Its teachings had not been easy, nor always kind, but they had been precise. And in their precision, he had found tools that allowed him to serve. The academy had taught the names of bones and the pathways of blood, the theory of humors and the logic of wounds, but it had also taught patience, and the skill of seeing what others missed. Most of all, it had given him an understanding of time, the way a fever rises not in a moment, but in hours, the way healing arrives not with fanfare, but with the simple return of appetite or the softening of breath. Arlen rose at last, slowly, his limbs reluctant but not pained. The floor was cold underfoot as he crossed to the basin in the corner and poured water over his hands, the chill biting enough to clear the last wisps of lingering memory. He dried them on a cloth worn smooth by years of use, then lit a small taper to chase away the gray. He did not rush. There was no bell in his home to summon him to prayer, no headmaster to dictate the hour's tasks. Yet his mornings bore a rhythm no less sacred. He moved through it instinctively, cleaning his instruments, checking the tinctures, organizing the new bundles of dried herb from the previous evening. As he worked, his thoughts continued to drift, not to the academy itself now, but to its aftermath. The first patients who had not trusted him. The first child he had failed. The first moment he realized that no education, no matter how rigorous, could soften the reality of powerlessness. There had been a winter long ago when a village nearby had been struck with a sudden wasting illness. Arlen, fresh from his apprenticeship and filled with conviction, had arrived with every remedy he knew. He had mixed, measured, and applied all according to instruction, and still the fever spread. He had stayed until the snow melted and the fields showed green again, and by then half the home stood empty. He remembered sitting beneath a leafless tree afterward, his hands raw from washing, his heart hollow with failure. It had been a turning point, not an ending but a shift. The academy had given him knowledge, but that winter gave him humility. It taught him that medicine was not mastery, but service, that one did not heal to prove skill, but to ease suffering. He had written no reports about that season. He had received no commendations, but from then on his steps had changed. He listened longer. He spoke more gently. He accepted that not all ailments had cures, and that presence, too, could be a form of healing. Chapter 10. The doctor sleeps a night like any other. By the time the town began to stir with the earliest sounds of morning, creaking shutters, the first call of a baker's cart, the rhythmic sweep of a broom over damp stone, Arlen had already returned to bed. Not for long, and not with the deep oblivion of dreamless sleep, but for a brief descent into the soft layers between waking and forgetting. His cot, humble and narrow, had never been a place of luxury, but it welcomed his weight like an old friend. The blanket held the scent of herbs and wool, and the pillow bore the faintest indentation of nights gone by. Outside, the day began to unfurl like parchment touched by sun, but within these walls, the world remained still. His hands rested on his chest, fingers slightly curled, not in tension, but in release. It was the kind of rest that does not erase exhaustion but honors it, the kind that follows after a full day lived with purpose. His breath, slow and steady, moved like the rise and fall of a tide retreating from the shore, each exhale a letting go. In the soft light creeping through the high window, dust motes turned lazily in the air, visible only when the sun caught them just so. They moved like drifting thoughts, unanchored and gentle. The tools of his trade remained where he had left them. The spoon resting clean on the table, the folded cloth stacked neatly, the bottles arranged with a quiet reverence that no one else would notice. To an outsider, the room might have seemed plain. No decorations, no trophies, no signs of achievement. But for Arlen, every object held weight, and every placement was a ritual. This was not a space for vanity. It was a space for returning, to balance, to rhythm, to the self. In this small chamber, he had treated dozens, perhaps hundreds of lives. Yet the air remained unburdened, perhaps because he had never tried to own the outcomes, only to meet them. The work was his companion, not his chain. The tiredness in his limbs was not weariness from striving, but the earned fatigue of presence. And so he rested, not because there was nothing to do, but because he had done enough for now. Sleep, when it came, did not rush him. It arrived slowly, curling around his edges like warm mist. His mind did not resist. It wandered, first to the garden at the monastery, where rosemary still held its shape against the breeze. Then to the boy from the night before, seated beside his mother, holding vigil in a house built more of hope than wood. Then to Alira, her hands folding linen, her eyes catching his with quiet instruction. And finally to no place at all, just breath, just the quiet hum of life beneath thought. In this state, time softened. The bells of the town might ring. A bird might call from the rooftop. A knock might come again sometime soon. But not yet. The world could wait a little longer. For now the doctor slept, not as a man burdened by his craft, but as one held by it, wrapped gently in the very stillness he had given to so many others. Beyond the doctor's shuttered window, the sun lifted higher into the sky, peeling away the shadows that clung to alleyways and awnings. The streets gradually awakened with a rhythm that was both familiar and sacred, boots over cobblestone, water sloshing into basins, the soft murmur of greetings exchanged over crates of early apples. Yet within Arlen's room, the world remained undisturbed. It was the rare kind of morning when no immediate summons arrived, no pounding at the door, no frantic voice from the lane below. And so, time passed slowly there, stretching like linen drawn across a sun-warmed frame. His breath, still deep and even, marked the minutes more gently than any bell could. The furrow between his brow had softened, and the tension behind his eyes had ebbed, leaving his face peaceful, almost unfamiliar in its rest. To someone watching, he might appear years younger, though the lines at the corners of his eyes remained. Evidence not of age alone, but of attention, of listening, of choosing to notice what others overlooked. The stillness of his room held memories as if they were etched into its very beams. Each corner had heard his voice in quiet counsel. Each floorboard had felt the pacing of long nights, the quiet creak of tired feet moving from cot to cupboard to table and back again. The very walls carried the scent of dried mint and old parchment, of oil lamps lit in darkness and extinguished at dawn. And in that suspended hour, while the town moved just beyond reach, those memories hovered like gentle ghosts, not to disturb but to witness. The mortar and pestle on the shelf did not clatter. The linen sachets did not sway. Yet everything in the room seemed to wait, not anxiously, but in patience. Even the air felt slower, as though respecting the rare pause of the one who seldom paused. There was dignity in that waiting, a recognition that healing extended not only to the sick, but to the healer himself. In his sleep, Arlen shifted slightly, murmuring something that never found form. Not a dream, perhaps, just a thought dissolving. And outside, life continued. A woman pulled her shutters open and sprinkled crumbs for birds. A child splashed water onto stone steps, giggling at the spray. A baker called out the price of fresh bread, unaware of the man resting just down the lane who had once cured his daughter of winter fever. The town did not stop for Arlen's slumber, nor did it need to. For years, he had moved quietly through its days and nights, easing pain where he could, holding space where he could not. His absence for a few more hours would not unravel its rhythm. In fact, it might do the opposite. He had given enough that the fabric of things could stretch slightly to let him breathe. This, too, was medicine, not prescribed, not distilled, but simply allowed. As the sunlight crept slowly across the room, brushing the edge of his cot and warming the folds of the woolen blanket, it touched a man not broken by his service, but quietly sustained by it. In the hush of morning, the doctor rested, and the world, for once, asked nothing more. Eventually, as the sun climbed higher and its rays thickened with the golden haze of late morning, Arlen stirred. Not abruptly, not with the startle of alarm, but gradually. His breath deepened first, then a shift of his hand beneath the blanket, followed by the quiet blink of his eyes against the soft brightness now filling the room. He lay still for a moment longer, feeling the gentle pull of gravity in his bones, the residual warmth in his muscles. It was not the kind of sleep that erases fatigue, but the kind that sets it down, carefully, like a basket of stones returned to the earth. He sat up slowly, rubbing the edge of his palm across his face, and allowed the waking world to reassemble around him. Familiar shelves, the scent of dried chamomile in the air, the faint sounds of life just beyond his walls. There was no urgency in his movements. The day would come at its own pace, and he would meet it not as someone chasing its demands, but as someone returning to an old rhythm already in motion. He reached for the pitcher and splashed water into the basin, the shock of it waking his skin with a clarity that no candlelight could summon. As he dried his hands and face with the linen hanging near the stove, his eyes moved briefly toward the small window and caught a glimpse of blue sky, clear, untroubled, vast. He did not smile, not outwardly, but something softened in his chest nonetheless. There would be patience, surely. There always were. A child's cough to soothe, an elder's joints to ease, a wound to clean, perhaps even a birth, if the woman down in the river quarter had gone into labor as expected. And Arlen would go. He would pack his satchel, restock the bomb, rewrap the cloths, refill the vial of elderflower, and go where he was needed. Not because he must, but because he could. Because the act of showing up, of bearing witness and offering presence, remained the quiet center of his life. The academy had taught him how to heal, but time had taught him why. Before stepping into the day, he paused. Just for a moment. One breath. Two. He touched the side of the satchel with his hand, feeling the worn leather, the stitching along its edge. So much had passed through its straps. Roots, salves, oils, folded letters of thanks, coins offered and refused. It was more than a bag. It was a ledger of care. Then, without ceremony, he fastened the latch, drew on his cloak, and opened the door. The world outside greeted him not with fanfare, but with light and sound and scent. The crispness of morning bread, the distant clatter of hooves, the rustle of wind in laundry lines. A few neighbors nodded. One offered a wordless smile. No one asked where he'd been. They did not need to. They knew. He had been resting like any other part of the body that works too hard. And now he was back, present, steady, whole. The healer walked down the lane once more, into a town that quietly exhaled his name in its rhythms. Arlen, the doctor, a man who slept and rose and began again. The doctor sleeps once more, as the village stirs to life. One more day behind him, another just ahead. Perhaps, in your own way, you too have walked beside him tonight, through candlelight, through gardens, through silence. If this story has brought you rest, or a moment of stillness, I invite you to return again. Like the pages of an old book, this world is always here, waiting. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and let your dreams carry you softly forward. Good night, and sleep well.